Eve was not the first woman. That's what most people believe. But the book of Genesis never actually says that. Before the garden, before the serpent, before sin had a name, there may have been another. A woman created not from Adam's rib, but from the same dust, equal, formed in the same breath. And her name has almost vanished from Scripture, Lilith. But here's where the story becomes unsettling. In Genesis chapter 1, it says, "So God created man in his own image. Male and female he created them. Male and female, together, created at the same time. No rib, no surgery, no delay." Yet in the very next chapter, the story changes. Adam is alone, searching, incomplete. And only then, God forms Eve from his side. Two accounts, two sequences, two women, or something omitted? For centuries, scholars have debated this contradiction. Was it poetic repetition, different sources woven together? Or was there once another story, now quiet? Because in ancient Jewish writings, texts not included in the modern canon, a name appears. A name linked to the first creation, Lilith. According to these traditions, she was formed from the same earth as Adam, not from his body, not beneath him, but beside him, equal in origin, equal in substance. And that equality became the problem. The story says Adam demanded authority. Lilith refused. She would not lie beneath him. She would not submit. And when conflict rose in Eden, she spoke the ineffable name of God and left. Not cast out, not expelled. She walked away. And after that moment, Scripture falls silent. No mention, no explanation. Only Eve remains. So what happened? Was Lilith ever meant to be part of Genesis? Or did her story emerge later to explain a tension already hiding in the text? Because if Genesis chapter 1 describes man and woman created together, and chapter 2 describes a woman created later, then something doesn't align. And ancient readers noticed. They tried to fill the silence. And in that silence, Lilith was born. But here is the real question. Was she a forgotten first woman, a myth layered onto Scripture, or a symbol of something far more dangerous? Because, in later tradition, Lilith does not remain equal. She becomes something darker, a night spirit, a demon, a warning. And that transformation may reveal more about human history than about her. If Lilith once stood beside Adam, why does Genesis never say her name? And if she never existed, why did so many ancient writers feel compelled to invent her? Tonight, we're not here to rewrite Scripture. We're here to examine its silence. Because sometimes, what a text does not say is more powerful than what it does. And the silence around Lilith is deafening. Before we go further into legend, we have to return to the text itself. Genesis, the foundation. Because whatever Lilith may be, the Bible tells a very specific story. In Genesis chapter 1, creation unfolds in order. Light, sky, land, stars, living creatures, and then humanity. So God created man in his own image, male and female. He created them. There is no delay here, no separation in time, no hierarchy mentioned. Man and woman appear together as the final act of creation, equal recipients of the divine image, equal bearers of breath. And for a moment, the story feels complete. But then the narrative restarts. Genesis chapter 2 slows everything down. The camera zooms in. Now the focus is not humanity, but one man, Adam, formed from dust, placed in a garden, given responsibility, naming animals, working the land, and then a strange statement appears. It is not good that the man should be alone. Alone. But in chapter 1, was he not already created alongside a woman? Why does chapter 2 describe him as solitary? Searching? Incomplete? The text tells us God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam. A rib is taken, flesh is closed, and from his side, Eve is formed. She is brought to him, presented, named. This at last is bone of my bones. And so the traditional story stands. Adam first, Eve second, woman derived from man, dependent in origin. It is simple, clean, structured, and for most readers, it ends there. But when read carefully, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 do not align perfectly. Chapter 1 describes simultaneous creation. Chapter 2 describes sequential creation. Two different tones, two different zoom levels, possibly two different traditions woven together. Many scholars suggest this is simply a literary technique, a poetic retelling, a macro view followed by a micro view, nothing more. And that explanation may be enough. But here is the tension. If Genesis 1 already introduced male and female created together, why does Genesis 2 feel the need to create the woman again? Why repeat it? Why restructure it? And more importantly, why does the second account introduce hierarchy, where the first did not? In chapter 1, there is no rib, no naming of the woman by the man, no emphasis on solitude, only joint creation, joint blessing, joint dominion. But in chapter 2, the structure shifts. Adam receives instruction first. Adam names. Adam sleeps. And Eve enters the story through him. Two portraits, same book, placed side by side. And for centuries, most readers accepted them as harmonious. But ancient interpreters were not always so comfortable, because when stories overlap and details shift, questions begin to form. And it was within those questions that another possibility emerged. What if Genesis chapter 1 described the first woman, and Genesis chapter 2 described the second? What if the text never intended to erase anyone, but later tradition simplified the narrative? This is not a claim, it is a question, and it is a question ancient readers once dared to ask. Because in the silence between chapter 1 and chapter 2, there is space. Space for interpretation, space for myth, space for a name that Genesis itself never speaks. And that is where we must go next. Because outside the canon, in the margins of Jewish tradition, that space was filled with a woman who refused to remain silent. Her name was Lilith. If Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 are simply different angles of the same event, then the tension should dissolve under closer reading. But it doesn't. In chapter 1, the language is symmetrical. Male and female, he created them. Them, plural, together. They are blessed together. They are given dominion together. There is no mention of one preceding the other. No hierarchy implied. Only shared origin, shared image, shared authority. But in chapter 2, the structure becomes linear. First Adam, then animals, then solitude, then Eve. The woman is not described as created with him, but as created for him, a helper suitable for him. And that phrase has echoed for centuries. Helper, suitable, derived, But here is the question few ask. Why is the first account so balanced, while the second feels asymmetrical? Why does one present equality in origin, and the other introduce sequence and dependence? Some scholars argue these chapters come from two ancient traditions, woven together by later editors. One tradition emphasizing cosmic order, the other emphasizing human intimacy and relationship. And that may be true. But even if that is true, the editor chose to keep both, side by side, without correction, without explanation, without commentary. That choice is significant, because ancient readers noticed. Jewish interpreters centuries ago struggled with this tension. They saw what we see: two descriptions, two tones, two beginnings. And instead of ignoring the difference, they tried to reconcile it. But reconciliation sometimes requires invention, or perhaps recovery. Imagine being an ancient reader. You read chapter 1, male and female, created together. Then you read chapter 2, Adam alone, woman formed later. Would you not ask, where did the first woman go? Was chapter 2 a retelling, or was chapter 1 describing someone else? And if there were two women, what happened to the first? Genesis does not answer. It does not defend itself. It does not clarify. It simply moves forward. And that silence is where interpretation begins. In ancient Jewish imagination, silence in Scripture was not emptiness. It was invitation. An invitation to explore, to question, to fill gaps with meaning. And in that interpretive space, a figure emerged, not from rebellion against Scripture, but from an attempt to protect its coherence. If Adam was not meant to be alone in chapter 1, then the woman created beside him must have existed. And if chapter 2 begins with Adam alone, then something must have happened in between. Something the text does not record. Something the text assumes, or chooses not to mention. And so the omission became a story, not written in Genesis, but whispered in later tradition. A story of conflict, of equality challenged, of departure instead of submission. And that story gave a name to the woman of chapter 1, Lilith. But here is what makes this even more intriguing. The Hebrew Bible does contain the name Lilith once, in the book of Isaiah, not as a woman in Eden, but as a night creature, a desolate spirit inhabiting ruins, a shadow in the wilderness. So the name existed, floating in the tradition, detached, mysterious. And when ancient interpreters searched for a solution to the Genesis tension, that name was waiting, ready to be attached. Was this coincidence or evolution? Was Lilith always meant to be connected to creation, or was she later woven into it? The text does not say, but by the early medieval period, the story had taken form. A first woman, created equal, refusing submission, leaving Eden, and replaced. And now, we must examine that forbidden narrative itself, because once we step outside the canon, the silence disappears, and the story becomes very clear. To understand Lilith, we must step outside the boundaries of Genesis, outside the canon, outside the text most people know, because her story does not appear in the Torah. It appears later, in writings not included in the modern Bible. One of the most famous sources is a medieval Jewish text, known as the Alphabet of Ben Sira. Not scripture, not prophecy, but tradition. And within that tradition, the silence of Genesis is filled. The story begins simply. God creates Adam from dust, and then creates a woman from the same dust. not from his rib, not after him, but alongside him. They are equal in origin, equal in substance, equal in breadth. But equality does not guarantee harmony. According to the text, conflict begins almost immediately. Adam insists on dominance. Lilith refuses. She will not lie beneath him. She will not accept subordination. She argues, "We were both created from the earth." The dispute escalates. It is no longer about position, but about authority, about order, about hierarchy. And then, Lilith does something extraordinary. She speaks the ineffable name of God, the sacred name, the name not meant to be uttered lightly. And in doing so, she rises and leaves Eden, not expelled, not cursed. She departs by her own will. Adam remains alone again. And according to this tradition, he cries out to God. The angels are sent to retrieve her. They find her near the Red Sea. They command her to return. She refuses, and from that refusal, her image begins to shift. She is no longer merely the first woman. She becomes dangerous, defiant, uncontrollable. The story transforms her. In later folklore, Lilith becomes associated with night spirits, with wilderness, with child-stealing demons, with chaos beyond civilization. The equal partner of Adam becomes a creature of the dark. But here is the critical question. Did the story evolve because she was feared? Or was she feared because the story evolved? Because if Lilith represents a woman created equal and refusing hierarchy, then her departure disrupts more than Eden. It disrupts structure, and ancient societies depended on structure. So, what happens to a narrative that challenges order? It is reshaped, reframed, sometimes demonized. Yet we must be careful. The alphabet of Ben Sira was written centuries after Genesis. It is not ancient in the way the Torah is ancient. It may reflect medieval imagination, symbolism, satire, interpretation layered onto scripture. So we are not uncovering a lost page of Genesis. We are witnessing the evolution of interpretation. But even interpretation reveals something powerful, because the Lilith story did not emerge in a vacuum. It emerged because readers felt tension in the text. They sensed a gap, and instead of ignoring it, they told a story to explain it. And that story endured. Why? Why did Lilith survive in Jewish folklore for centuries? Why did her name appear in amulets meant to protect newborn children? Why did mothers fear her in the night? Why did mystics write about her? Because once a story enters tradition, it rarely does so without reason. And once it survives, it rarely survives without resonance. So now we stand at a crossroads. Either Lilith is a medieval myth created to reconcile Genesis, or she reflects a much older tradition that once circulated more widely, a memory, fragmented, reshaped, but not entirely erased. And if that second possibility holds even a shadow of truth, then Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 may not be poetic repetition. They may be echoes of two beginnings. And if there were two beginnings, then Eden was not as simple as we were taught. At this point, Lilith stands between two worlds. Not fully scripture, not fully myth. A figure born from silence. But what matters now is not whether she existed. It is what she represents. Because every enduring figure in religious tradition carries symbolic weight, and Lilith carries a great deal of it. In the Genesis narrative we know, Eve is formed from Adam's side. Her origin ties her to him, bone of his bones, flesh of his flesh, connection, dependency, unity. But in the Lilith tradition, there is no rib, no derivation. She does not come from Adam. She stands beside him, formed from the same earth. And that difference changes everything. Because if two beings are formed from the same dust, who has authority over the other? In ancient societies, order was sacred. Hierarchy was stability. Structure was survival. So a woman created equal to the first man, and refusing submission, becomes more than an inconvenience. She becomes a disruption, and disruptions must be resolved. Sometimes by rewriting the narrative, sometimes by shifting the character. In Lilith's case, she shifts from equal partner to rebel, from rebel to exile, from exile to demon. And once labeled a demon, her authority is erased, her equality neutralized, her story contained. But here is what makes this transformation fascinating. Lilith is not destroyed in the tradition. She is not forgotten. She is reinterpreted. She becomes a night spirit, associated with wilderness, with danger beyond the walls of civilization. In ancient symbolism, the wilderness represents chaos, the untamed, the unstructured, and Lilith is placed there, outside the garden, outside order, outside control. Was that coincidence, or was it narrative necessity? Pause. Because if Eden represents harmony, and Eve represents relational unity, then Lilith represents something else. Autonomy, choice, departure. She is the only figure in the creation story who leaves by her own will. Adam does not leave. Eve does not leave. They are expelled. Lilith walks away. And that detail, whether historical or symbolic, is powerful. What kind of character chooses exile over submission? What does that reveal about the tension embedded in the Genesis accounts? Some modern interpreters see Lilith as a symbol of suppressed equality. Others see her as a later myth imposed onto Scripture. Both views may contain truth, because whether she began as legend or theology, her survival suggests resonance. People saw themselves in her, feared her, defended against her, reclaimed her. Across centuries, Lilith transforms again. In Kabbalistic writings, she becomes a figure of cosmic imbalance. In medieval folklore, a cautionary spirit. In modern reinterpretations, a symbol of independence. One name, many layers. And that layered evolution tells us something crucial. Lilith is not just about a missing woman in Eden. She is about what happens when a text contains ambiguity. Ambiguity invites interpretation. Interpretation invites narrative. And narrative reshapes memory. So now we must ask, was Lilith created to explain Genesis? Or does Genesis feel incomplete because an older tradition once lingered behind it? If Genesis chapter 1 described equality and chapter 2 introduced hierarchy, then Lilith stands precisely at that intersection. The fault line between two visions of origin. And fault lines rarely exist without pressure beneath them, because once we admit that possibility, we are no longer debating folklore. We are confronting the nature of sacred text itself, how it is compiled, how it is transmitted, how it preserves some voices and silences others. And that realization changes the stakes. Because if Lilith represents a suppressed voice, then her story is not just about Eden. It is about authorship, authority, and the shaping of tradition. And that is where the tension intensifies. Because the next question is not about Lilith. It is about who controls the narrative. If Lilith is standing at the fault line between two creation visions, then we are no longer asking a small question. We are asking a structural one. Who shaped the final form of Genesis? And why were both accounts preserved? Without explanation, the Hebrew Bible did not fall from the sky as a bound book. It developed over centuries, through oral tradition, through scribes, through editors, through communities deciding which texts to preserve and which to leave behind. This is not controversy. It is history. Sacred texts are transmitted, compiled, curated, and when multiple traditions exist, someone decides how they are arranged. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 sit side by side, not merged, not harmonized fully, just placed together. That placement is intentional, but intention does not eliminate tension. Imagine early Israelite communities preserving ancient stories. One tradition describing a cosmic balanced creation, male and female together. Another describing a more intimate narrative. Adam formed first, woman formed later. Both meaningful, both theological, both true in different ways. But when woven together, their differences remain visible. And visible differences invite interpretation. Interpretation invites commentary. And commentary sometimes invites myth. Lilith may not have been erased. She may never have been in the canonical text at all. But the idea of her emerged because readers sensed instability. And instability in sacred narrative can feel dangerous, because origin stories shape identity. They shape gender roles. They shape authority. They shape theology. If chapter 1 presents shared dominion, and chapter 2 presents relational hierarchy, then which vision defines humanity? Which one becomes normative? Which one becomes quoted? Which one becomes preached? Over time, religious communities emphasize coherence, consistency, clarity. Ambiguity is uncomfortable. So, the simpler narrative prevails. Adam first, Eve second, order established. But the earlier symmetry remains embedded in chapter 1, unresolved. And this is where escalation occurs. Because Lilith, whether historical or symbolic, represents what happens when ambiguity refuses to stay quiet. She is the embodiment of unresolved tension, the question that would not disappear. And when questions persist, they sometimes become characters. Characters become stories. Stories become warnings. And warnings become doctrine. In later Jewish mysticism, Lilith is paired with demonic forces. In medieval folklore, her name is inscribed on protective amulets. Fear crystallizes around her. Why? Because stories that challenge structure must be contained. And containment often takes mythic form. But here is the nuance we must not lose. The canonization of Scripture was not a single event. It was gradual. The Torah was central early. Other writings developed over time. Debates occurred. Interpretations shifted. Yet Genesis remained. Both accounts remained. The tension remained. So perhaps the editors were not hiding anything. Perhaps they preserved both visions intentionally, allowing future generations to wrestle with them. And wrestling produces stories. Lilith may be one of those stories. Not a conspiracy, not a deletion, but an interpretive echo. Still, the echo grew powerful enough to survive for centuries. And that survival demands explanation. Because if Lilith is merely a medieval invention, why does she feel older? Why does she fit so seamlessly into the Genesis tension? Why does she resolve the contradiction so cleanly? One woman created in chapter 1, another in chapter 2. Conflict in between. Silence explained. It is almost too neat. Which forces us to ask, did later writers invent Lilith to explain Genesis? Or did they preserve a fragment of a tradition that once circulated more freely, before canon solidified? We cannot prove either, but we cannot ignore the question. Because once we admit that sacred texts pass through human hands, we must also admit that interpretation is inevitable, and interpretation reshapes memory. So now the stakes are higher. Lilith is no longer just a mysterious first woman. She becomes a mirror, reflecting how communities handle tension, how they preserve unity, how they negotiate ambiguity. And that brings us to the next turning point. Because if Lilith represents unresolved tension, then we must confront the twist. What if the question is not whether Lilith existed, but why her story refuses to die? Up until now, we've been asking a historical question. Was Lilith real? Was she an ancient tradition? Was she invented to reconcile Genesis? But what if that is the wrong question? What if Lilith was never meant to be history, but revelation? Not revelation of events, but revelation of tension. Because sometimes a culture does not create a story to record the past. It creates a story to process anxiety, to externalize conflict, to give shape to something uncomfortable. And what is more uncomfortable than equality in a hierarchical world? Genesis chapter 1 presents shared image, shared dominion, shared blessing. Genesis chapter 2 introduces sequence, structure, relational order. Both can coexist, but their coexistence produces friction, and friction seeks narrative resolution. Lilith may be that resolution, not as a forgotten woman, but as a narrative outlet. The embodiment of a question ancient readers were not ready to answer directly. Consider this. In the Lilith story, she refuses to lie beneath Adam. That detail is specific, intimate, symbolic. It is not about gardening. It is not about fruit. It is about position, authority, control. If she refuses position, she refuses structure. And if she refuses structure, she threatens order. In many ancient societies, order was sacred. It reflected cosmic harmony. So, a woman who claims equality in origin and autonomy in choice becomes destabilizing. And destabilizing figures are rarely allowed to remain neutral. They are recast, reframed, feared. Now imagine the Genesis tension without Lilith. Two creation accounts. One balanced, one hierarchical. No explanation. That ambiguity lingers. But introduce Lilith, and the tension resolves. Chapter 1 describes the first woman. Chapter 2 describes the second. Conflict in between explains the shift. Hierarchy restored. Order justified. The contradiction disappears. The story becomes linear, clean, stable. That is the twist. Lilith may not challenge the structure. She may protect it. Because if equality existed first and failed, then hierarchy becomes necessity, not oppression, not imposition, but correction. The myth does not destroy order. It explains why order exists, and that reframes everything. Lilith is no longer a suppressed heroine. She becomes a theological mechanism, a bridge between two visions of creation, a narrative buffer. But here is where the twist deepens. In later centuries, Lilith is reclaimed, reinterpreted, resurrected. She transforms again. In modern thought, she is no longer a demon. She becomes a symbol of independence, of voice, of resistance. The same figure, opposite meanings, which suggests something profound. Lilith is less about ancient history and more about the shifting fears and hopes of each generation. She absorbs projection. She reflects cultural anxiety, and that may explain her endurance. So perhaps the real mystery is not, was there a first woman before Eve? Perhaps the real mystery is, why does the human mind return to this possibility? Why does equality before hierarchy feel both compelling and dangerous? Why does Genesis leave enough space for that question to survive? And why did ancient interpreters feel compelled to answer it with a name? Lilith, if she never existed, she still reveals something. If she existed only in imagination, that imagination was responding to something real, something embedded in the text, something unresolved. And unresolved tensions do not disappear. They echo across centuries, across interpretations, across traditions, which brings us to the final layer. If Lilith reflects how we handle ambiguity, what does that say about the way sacred texts are read today? If Lilith is not simply a forgotten woman, but a reflection of tension, then her implications stretch far beyond Eden. They reach into theology, into culture, into the way sacred texts are understood today. Arc A, theological implications. Genesis contains two creation accounts. That is not speculation. It is observable. One cosmic, one intimate, one symmetrical, one sequential. For centuries, theologians have harmonized them. Some say chapter 2 zooms into chapter 1. Others say the differences are stylistic. Both explanations preserve unity, but Lilith exposes something else. She exposes interpretive freedom, because when ambiguity exists, interpretation multiplies, and interpretation shapes doctrine. If chapter 1 is emphasized, shared image becomes central. If chapter 2 is emphasized, sequence becomes central. Both are scripture, but emphasis determines theology. Lilith forces us to see that choice, not as conspiracy, but as hermeneutics. And once we see that, we realize something powerful. Sacred texts are not just read, they are prioritized. And prioritization changes meaning. If equality appears first, and hierarchy appears second, which one becomes foundational? That question has shaped centuries of discourse, and Lilith stands precisely at that crossroads. Spike #9. Which creation vision becomes normative? Arc B, cultural implications. Beyond theology, stories shape societies. Origin narratives define roles. They define expectations. They define order. If the dominant story is Adam first, Eve second, then relational structure follows. But introduce Lilith, and the structure complicates. Suddenly, there was once equality. Suddenly, departure was possible. Suddenly, hierarchy was not inevitable, but reactive. That possibility unsettles systems, which is why, in medieval folklore, Lilith becomes dangerous. Night spirit, child stealer, demon. She is pushed outside the city walls, placed in the wilderness, symbolically exiled, because cultures often exile what threatens coherence. But in modern reinterpretations, Lilith is reclaimed. No longer demon, no longer threat, but icon, symbol of voice, symbol of autonomy. The same narrative, reversed, meaning. That reversal reveals something deeper. Stories do not remain static. They absorb the anxieties of their era. They mirror cultural tension, and Lilith mirrors it perfectly. Spike has Hon 0. The same figure, a different fear. Arc C. Interpretive implications today. Now, bring this forward. Today, millions read Genesis literally. Millions read it symbolically. Millions read it devotionally. Some search for hidden meanings. Some avoid them. But the tension remains embedded in the text. Two accounts. Different structures. No explanation between them. And that silence still invites curiosity. Lilith continues to appear in books, in films, in discussions, in theological debates. Why? Because the ambiguity never closed. It was preserved, which may be the most remarkable fact of all. The editors of Genesis did not erase the tension. They preserved it. They allowed future readers to wrestle. And wrestling produces depth. Perhaps Lilith survives because she represents the human instinct to question, to notice gaps, to fill silence with story, not to destroy scripture, but to understand it. She is the echo of interpretation, and interpretation is inevitable, which means the real implication is not about Lilith. It is about us, about how we handle ambiguity, how we balance unity and tension, how we respond when texts refuse to resolve cleanly. Spike has Honor 1. If Genesis preserved the tension intentionally, what does that say about how we are meant to read it? And that leads us to the final question. Not about history, not about folklore, but about silence. Because sometimes, what survives for centuries does so not because it was true, but because it addressed something that never stopped being relevant. And Lilith addresses something that never stopped being relevant. We began with a simple disruption. Eve was not the first woman, or at least, Genesis never clearly says she was. We traced the tension between two creation accounts. We stepped into forgotten traditions. We watched a figure emerge from silence and transform across centuries. But now we arrive at the edge, not of certainty, but of reflection. Was Lilith a real memory preserved in folklore? A medieval attempt to reconcile textual tension? A symbolic projection of cultural anxiety? Or something else entirely? The truth is, we cannot prove her existence, but we cannot erase her persistence either. She has lingered too long, moved through too many centuries, shifted through too many meanings, to be dismissed as trivial. Genesis chapter 1 speaks of male and female created together. Genesis chapter 2 speaks of a woman formed later. The text never explains the difference. It simply continues. Perhaps that silence was intentional. Perhaps sacred texts are not designed to eliminate tension, but to preserve it. Because tension invites wrestling, and wrestling produces understanding. Lilith may not be hidden in the Bible, but she is hidden in the space between verses, in the questions readers dared to ask, in the discomfort they felt, in the stories they told to make sense of it. And that space still exists. If equality appeared first, and hierarchy appeared second. What does that mean? If two visions of origin stand side by side, which one defines us? If the text refuses to resolve the difference, are we meant to choose? Or meant to wrestle? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, if Lilith never existed, why does the idea of her feel so possible? Why does the silence between chapter 1 and chapter 2 still feel unfinished? Maybe the mystery was never about a missing woman. Maybe it was about how we read sacred words, how we handle ambiguity, how we respond when scripture leaves room for interpretation. Because, in the end, Lilith does not demand belief. She demands reflection. Reflection on tension. Reflection on structure. reflection on the stories we inherit, and the stories we create to explain them. So we leave you not with an answer, but with a question. If Genesis preserved two beginnings, what else in the text might carry layers we have not fully explored? And if a name whispered in folklore can survive for centuries, what does that tell us about the power of silence? Eve remains the mother of the living, that is written. But somewhere in the margins of tradition, a shadow stands beside the dust, and her name, whether history or metaphor, continues to echo: Lilith.